Greetings and welcome back to the Old Ways Rising Farm YouTube channel. I'm going to do a second video today talking about permaculture design and using a model to discuss it. If you haven't seen the first one, I introduced the idea of permaculture zones, and we discussed the very lush landscape of New Jersey and a model of a historic farm from there. So if you haven't seen that one, I'll put a little link in the description, a little link up at the top of the screen, and you can pause this video and go to that, and then come back, and we will look at a second model, this one in an arid environment, okay? So go watch that one if you haven't seen it, and I will see you back in a few minutes for this one. The model we're going to be looking at today is another property that was described by the Historic American Building Survey. And again, this is an open access database of architecture and related material, right? There's boats in there, there's properties in there, there's botanic gardens in there. There's a ton of stuff in there. It's not just the architecture. But they are focused on the architecture, so we have to read between the lines a little bit in modeling some of the other aspects. You can tip the camera down below. So these never have all of the information you want to describe the full botany of the site, but there's quite a lot of information, and that plus you can glean a lot more from Google Maps. You can glean a lot of information from Google Maps, and you can get USGS topo maps and again fill in a lot of the blanks there. And just as with the last one, this is a 1 to 240 scale. And it is to scale both in the plan view as well as the topography. So you can see, again, if you watch the first one, you can see this is a much flatter site than the previous one was. That one was built into a hillside. This one is relatively flat. There isn't a whole lot going on with the topography. This is from Colorado. This is near the Purgatory River, about a mile from the Purgatory River. And it's kind of up at the top of the plateau, and then the terrain, if you look at Google Maps again, the terrain kind of drops off here to the east. This is the east, west, north, south, to orient you on the map. It's pointed this way relative to the camera so that you can see into kind of the pockets in the trees here and see the buildings. But this is the north edge. So, and the terrain drops off over that way. So the history of this is the Adam and Bessie Arnott homestead. The Arnott family immigrated from Germany in the late 1800s and started building this homestead in the first decade of the 1900s. So there's your time period. And it was a ranch. So first you can see a lot of things very typical of ranch building. This whole complex where we have a bunch of small sheds and barns and a lot of subdivided cattle handling pens is very typical of ranches, right? This is ranch architecture. And this little model kind of only nips the corner of that, and then the rest extends off. And then there's a cluster of other family members that, you know, the kids went off and built some other homesteads of their own, right? So there's another little homestead over here, and there's another little homestead over that way. So it's a fairly extensive plan, and it's absolutely worth getting the data for this and looking at the whole thing. There's a lot of interesting tidbits on how people are interacting with the landscape in the whole plan. You have windmill wells, you have like wind power driven wells, you have root cellars, dedicated root cellars by a lot of these, but it's just it would be a room-size model to build the whole thing at this scale. And this is the section of it that I thought had the most interesting things to talk about. So, let's talk about them. This one has a very clear, zonation to it, right? This region with this dominant house, and this is labeled as a generator shed on the plan. I suspect originally there's more to it than that, but that's what it's labeled on the plan. Then we have a fenced courtyard around the house. We have what are presumably gardens outside of it. I'll turn around and show you this from a couple different angles as we go through. But you have a very clear zone 1 here. You have a very clear zone 1, And I don't know exactly what this large open area is, and then like you're going out of zone 1 to a completely different area of activity to get over to the cattle handling pens and the barn area, right? It is not it doesn't have the condensed feel that the previous one did, which is interesting. Different, different perspective on how to set it up. Also very, very different landscape. Now, what I think is the most interesting thing about this is how the primary residence, which is this long adobe building I'm pointing to here, interacts with the greater landscape. And if you have ever been to or experienced the climate of Colorado, it is a climate of extremes even within a given day. Okay? So my family lived there for a very brief period of time. I was pretty young, but I do remember that, even in the middle of summer, you would wake up to a frigid morning and have, sweatpants and a sweatshirt on. By lunch, it would be so stifling hot that you could barely breathe. And then by dinner, it's cold again. Right? So you have huge temperature swings. And that's fairly typical of arid regions. So you have these huge temperature swings throughout the day. And if we just kind of focus on what's happening in this zone 1 area, everything about this is screaming passive temperature regulation. Okay? This one is all about efficiency. The last one was efficiency in terms of space utilization. This is sprawling, right? This is a big, big ranch. They're not concerned about space utilization. It's obvious from the plan. But they're very concerned about efficiency and temperature regulation. Okay? So first we have the construction material of the dominant buildings. And they are adobe. Okay? Adobe has an extremely high mass, therefore high thermal mass and high ability to store temperature, to regulate the temperature, right? It will store the heat during the day and release it at night. And then when it cools down to a middle temperature by morning, it takes a long time to heat up in the heat of the day. So by building your house out of adobe in that sort of climate, you are averaging the morning and evening and midday temperatures, right? So you're very efficiently averaging out those temperatures. And then the dominant residence is built right into this large, I'm just going to kind of tip this up so you can kind of see down in there a little bit better. Good? You can see? Good. The dominant building there is built into this large rock outcropping. And a lot of these boulders are similar in size to the structures. And those boulders are approximately to scale as best as I could determine from the Google Maps photos. But they're reasonable, right? They're not clones of the original boulders, but they're pretty reasonable. So these boulders, big as houses, are going to do the same thing. They're going to concentrate the midday sun and average that temperature out through the evening, cooling down through the night, and then being, warmer than the ambient environment in the morning, but but cooler than midday. So again, we are averaging out the temperature over the course of the day. Okay, they will also stay warm and concentrate heat in the winter. So if you look, remember, this is north, this is south. These deciduous trees are certainly planted, right? This is, again, temperature regulation for the buildings, right? We have deciduous trees shading the southern aspect of the house for the summer. Not an accident. You look pre-central air buildings, you're very, very often, I don't want to use the word always, but it's pretty darn close to always. You look at these old farmsteads, you've always got big, gigantic deciduous trees south of your main buildings, right? This is shading it in the summer, but dropping its leaves in winter. I don't know what species these are. I would guess based on the time period, their appearance, where they are, that they're planted, I would guess probably um, some sort of leguminous tree or some sort of East Asian elm. Mostly because that's what the NRCS was pushing for planting for windbreaks and stuff in this area in this time period. But that's high on assumption and low on knowledge. It's not specified. So we have these deciduous trees shading it in the summer, but then allowing that southern light in the winter. Again, Colorado is cold in a winter. It gets tremendous blasts out of the north, straight out of Canada in the north wind. These rocks are also a windbreak, breaking the north wind. So we have the material doing the job of averaging out the temperatures in the summer, shading it in the summer, but then we're concentrating sunlight in the winter and blocking the north wind in the winter. So we have a lot of very deliberate use of this landscape to moderate the environment in the home in a completely passive fashion. There is no active energy expenditure in order to do that. Okay, that's very important in this sort of climate. I'm not going to talk too much about the cattle holding facilities. Large scale ranching is its own topic, and a topic that I honestly don't have a whole lot of experience with. But it is interesting that we are enclosing the homestead. This is completely fenced, and we have a couple different areas of fencing. I would love to know what was done with this area. To spend the time and effort to put fence posts in what is obviously a rocky terrain. Something important was happening in this. This was probably some sort of, kind of zone 2 activity. We don't know what. These would have probably been the main gardens. Okay. And I would also love to know this auxiliary adobe building. To build that out of adobe is a lot more effort than you need for simply a generator house, right? So there's more to the story of this building I wish I knew. There's more to the story of this secondary courtyard that I wish I knew. But we do have a very definite Zone 1, Zone 2, Zone 3 sort of architecture. We just don't know what they did with the Zone 2. This little water feature is, if you look at any of the maps, it's dry now, but this is a dammed natural saddle in the hill that goes off the edge of this escarpment, off the edge of the plateau, down toward the Purgatory River, which is that way. And we're storing runoff. Okay, we're storing runoff. So probably cattle water, probably irrigation for the garden, right? This and the gardens are not far apart. Okay? The gardens are still being attached to the Zone 1 activity center, but they're not far from the water source. This is labeled as a garage, right? So the house to the garage is about the same distance as the gardens to water source. Okay? And this is an artificial water source. This is a built dam that is stopping off runoff. In a arid habitat like this, you have to have that sort of water control. In terms of edible plants, we don't know that much. The only thing I can say for sure is that in this region, these conifer stands in rocks tend to have a lot of pinyon pine in them, tend to have a lot of juniper in them. So we can assume that this is some mix of those two species. What mix of those two species? Again, there's no details on this in the plan. But we can assume that probably there is some food gathering here. And there would also be a different vegetation type here in general, rather than out here in terms of wild gathering opportunities. Partly because the rocks are creating a microclimate, which is going to moderate the winter temperature. The leaves fall off of these deciduous trees, the southern sun comes in and heats up those rocks. So you'll have a warmer microclimate around those rocks. And rocks like this concentrate dew in the morning. There are many cultures, this is very well documented from Easter Island, there are many cultures which will put stone mulch on their gardens deliberately to concentrate dew. It's an arid region adaptation. So, again, there's a lot I wish I knew. And as recent immigrants from Germany, we don't know how much detail they would have known coming in, but they certainly knew enough to put the house in an amazing spot. So there's a lot to talk about in here. There's a lot more I wish I knew. To adapt this quickly, to have the perfect architecture in the perfect location, only being, 20 years from when they immigrated from Germany, they had a source of information somewhere. So I wish I knew a lot more about the details. With this house built directly into the rocks like this, you can assume that there was more deliberacy than what we can just get from a basic site plan, and there was more going on here. So I would love to know the rest of that story. And I'd love to know your comments. I'd love to hear what you think about this model, and if you'd like to keep seeing videos on models like this, and if you'd like to see any videos on building models like this, or working with the GIS program to put this sort of information together. And if you have ranching experience or experience with this area, and you have ideas about what else might have been going on in some of these, clear activity centers of the Zone 2 fenced area that has no data on it, or the stony area, if you have knowledge of this, direct knowledge of this region of the world, and would like to contribute to that, pop something into the comment box. I'm sure that other viewers would be as interested to hear your comments as I am. So if you like this video, go give it a thumbs up, and I hope that you will join us next time on Old Ways Rising Farm.